Welcome back year 2 to our topics lesson. We're going to continue looking at the Vikings, but we're going to start by looking at rural settlements. In our previous lessons, we looked at the Vikings and their raids and famous Vikings, but what happened for the everyday people? Now, most of the Scandinavians of the Viking Age lived peacefully by agriculture, rearing animals, and growing crops in small villages. Now, the main farming activity in all the settled parts of Scandinavia went well beyond the Arctic Circle. Farmers would have many animals such as cattle, pigs, sheep, and goats, and they were reared by the Vikings. In Denmark and southern Sweden, farming was also very important. The main crops were barley, rye, oats, peas, beans, and cabbage. Denmark may even have produced lots and lots of grain. In Arctic Norway and other areas of Norway and Sweden around the Arctic Circle, hunting and fishing made a significant contribution to the diet of a well-provided and valuable trade goods. Now, in Denmark, small villages were the normal form of settlement. Now, these villages seem to have shifted their sites slightly every 100 of years or so, and only settled down onto permanent sites after the end of the Viking Age. Now, in Norway, there are few areas of fertile land, so they couldn't really grow crops. And the broken nature of the terrain led to a dispersed settlement pattern, which isolated farms into small pockets of cultivated land. Now, this is also the same in Sweden. Now, the population of Scandinavia was rising during the Viking Age, and this period saw expansions of the area under cultivation and lots of creations of new settlements. Now, the most typical Viking Age farming building was the longhouse, which we looked at in our last lesson. This accommodated both people and animals under one roof. Farms had many outbuildings for the use of workshops or storage. A common type of smaller building was a sunken floored hut, which was half buried in the ground. These buildings were well insulated, so it means that they were kept very warm, which they needed in such a cold climate. And these may have been used for storing products which needed to be kept cool, like milk. Now, the building techniques reflect the environment. So in much of Norway and Sweden, where the timber is plentiful, buildings had solid wooden walls and roofs made of layers of waterproof birch bark covered in insulated turf. Now, you have to remember, in both Norway and Sweden, it is incredibly cold. So what were Viking towns like? So Scandinavia had no true towns before the Viking Age, though there were several seasonal market centres. When towns did spring up, it didn't happen overnight. Development went hand in hand with the growth of the royal power. And most towns seem to have been deliberately founded by rulers to encourage control and profit from trade. So the towns in Arctic Norway would profit by trading salmon fish, for example. Now, the earliest towns in Scandinavia are Ribe, Birka, and Hedeby, and they all date from the late 18th century. The Danish monarchy played an important role in the foundation of all three, which suggests that they were all deliberately made by the royal family for trade. Now, Ribe has even survived today and is still a trade centre, making it Scandinavia's oldest town. However, both Birka and Hedeby were abandoned many years ago due to falling sea levels. So now we're going to take a look at the settlements in Iceland. Now, Viking chiefs settled in Iceland, dividing the good grazing land around the coast amongst their followers. This was a new land where nobody lived. Now, the first settlers of Iceland were two brothers, Ingolf and Horsleif. Now, Horsleif was killed during his first winter there, but after 3 years of exploring, Ingolf made a permanent settlement in Reykjavik, which is now the capital city of Iceland. More Viking settlers soon followed. Most were from the west of Norway, but there was also Danish and Swedish and Scandinavians from other areas. By 930, nearly all the good grazing land had been claimed, and there isn't that much in Iceland. Except in the southwest, most of the settlements were close to the coast. The barren mountains and lava plains of the interior were, as they still are, uninhabited. Now, Iceland has many volcanoes, and the Vikings could not set up farms and settlements anywhere near them, not just because it's dangerous, but the land would not allow anything to grow. Now, the ancient language of the Vikings is no longer spoken, but the Icelandic language is the closest you will ever hear to how a Viking spoke. They use much of the same language and dialogue as their ancestors used thousands of years ago. Now, the name Iceland was given to it by the Viking Floki. Now, Floki set out to the Faroe Islands, but somehow managed to end up in Iceland. So he had to spend his first winter there. He was unprepared, and all his livestock, his animals, they died of starvation. The sea ice was so slow breaking up that year that he was forced to spend yet another year there. So thoroughly disillusioned by his experience, Floki decided to call his new land Iceland. In our next lesson, we look at the Vikings in Greenland, we look at Viking warriors again in more detail, and what Scandinavia was like after the Vikings. We'll also continue to look at other areas of the world that they invaded. Until then, year set 2, take care, and I'll see you soon.